I watched my mother place her manicured hand firmly on the document. Her diamond ring caught the chandelier light as she looked me directly in the eyes. The dining room felt suffocatingly quiet. "Arlo, I have changed my will," she announced coldly. "You will not get a single cent." My stepfather Richard smirked from across the mahogany table. "All right," I smiled calmly. "Then do not expect a single cent from me either." I slowly set my fork and knife down and stood up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear how this family betrayal unfolded. The tension from that dinner lingered in my mind as I drove home that evening. At 32, I had built my life independently as a software engineer at a respected tech company. Everything I owned, I had earned myself putting myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs. The irony of my mother threatening to disinherit me was that I had never counted on her money. My relationship with my mother Eleanor had deteriorated after my father died when I was 14. He was a kind, hard-working man who had left a modest inheritance, specifically for my education. Somehow my mother had taken control of those funds, and I never saw a penny of what my father intended for me. Within 8 months of his funeral, she remarried Richard Blackwood, a wealthy businessman 20 years her senior. The whirlwind romance seemed more like a calculated business merger than love. Richard came with country club memberships, vacation properties, and business connections my mother had always coveted. From that point on, Eleanor transformed from the occasionally demanding but loving mother I knew into someone obsessed with appearances, wealth, and social standing. Family dinners became networking opportunities. Holidays turned into elaborate displays of affluence rather than moments of connection. Everything became transactional, even her affection. My mother had always been concerned with status, but Richard amplified these tendencies. He isolated her from relatives who did not meet his standards of sophistication or wealth. He encouraged her to drop lifelong friendships with people who could not advance their social position. Slowly, their world narrowed to only those who could benefit them financially or socially. Richard never confronted me directly, but his psychological tactics were effective. He would casually mention how disappointing it must be for my mother that I chose a simple career in technology rather than joining the family business. He would question my choices from where I lived to who I dated always with a veneer of concern that barely concealed his judgment. The most painful aspect was watching what happened to my younger sister, Jessica. At 26, she still lived at home, financially dependent on our mother and Richard due to an autoimmune condition that required expensive treatments. Her medical vulnerability became their method of control. They paid her medical bills but reminded her constantly of their generosity, creating a debt of gratitude that seemed impossible to repay. I tried repeatedly to convince Jessica to move out, offering to help with her expenses, but she worried about angering our mother. The golden handcuffs were tight around her wrists. The family wealth that Richard and my mother now controlled originally came from my maternal grandfather. He built a successful construction company that expanded into real estate development. When he died, my mother inherited significant assets. What many forget, however, is that my father had worked alongside my grandfather for 15 years, helping to grow the business through difficult economic times. His contributions were substantial, but conveniently forgotten after his death. When Richard married my mother, he gradually inserted himself into the family business operations. First as an advisor, then as a partner, and eventually as the primary decision-maker. My mother seemed happy to let him take control, dazzled by his business acumen and the lifestyle he provided. I had serious questions about some of his business practices, particularly how he leveraged the company to acquire personal assets, but my concerns were dismissed as jealousy or ignorance of sophisticated business strategies. That fateful dinner had been scheduled under the pretense of discussing the family trust and future business opportunities. I attended primarily out of concern for Jessica, who had texted me anxiously about the meeting all week. When I arrived at their sprawling Tudor-style home, I immediately sensed something was wrong. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension. The dining room that evening was immaculate, as always. Crystal glasses caught the light, expensive wine breathed in decanters, and the catered meal was served on china that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything appeared perfect, which in my family always signaled impending conflict. Richard dominated the conversation through the appetizer and main course, discussing business associates' recent acquisitions and the failings of various relatives who had requested financial assistance. My mother nodded approvingly at his every statement. Jessica stared at her plate, barely eating. I maintained polite conversation while watching the dynamic unfold. As the dessert was served, my mother cleared her throat and retrieved a folder from the sideboard, the will. That was when she made her announcement with Richard, watching with barely disguised satisfaction. The exact exchange will forever be seared into my memory. "Arlo, I have changed my will," she said, her voice clinically detached. "You have chosen to pursue your own path rather than honoring the family legacy. You have rejected numerous opportunities to join the business. Therefore, I see no reason why the family wealth should support someone who has contributed nothing to it. You will not get a single cent." Richard nodded as if this logic was irrefutable. Furthermore, my mother continued, "Any protest or attempt to challenge this decision will result in consequences for Jessica as well." My sister looked up in alarm. This was clearly news to her. I looked at the three of them, this tableau of toxic family dynamics, and felt a strange sense of clarity and calm. "All right," I replied with a measured smile. "Then do not expect a single cent from me either. Not now, not ever." I carefully set down my utensils and stood up, straightening my jacket. "Jessica, call me whenever you need me," I said to my sister, whose eyes had filled with tears. "Mother Richard, thank you for dinner and for making your position so crystal clear. It makes my decisions much simpler moving forward." I walked out without another word, ignoring my mother calling my name with increasing anger. In my car, I sat for a moment, hands trembling slightly, despite my outward calm. My phone immediately lit up with a text from Jessica. "I am so sorry. I had no idea she would do this. Please do not hate me too." The drive home was a blur of memories and emotions. I called my closest friend David, who had known my family since childhood. "She finally did it, huh?" he said after I explained. "Honestly, I am surprised it took her this long to explicitly disinherit you. Richard has been working on her for years. I should have seen it coming," I admitted. "But using Jessica as leverage crosses a new line." "What will you do now?" David asked. I thought about my father, how he had always emphasized self-reliance and integrity over wealth or status. "I will keep my dignity and independence. And I will find a way to help Jessica without crawling back to them." Over the next few days, my mother called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that evolved from angry demands to return to the house for further discussion to tearful accusations of betrayal. I listened to each one but did not respond. Richard predictably began working through intermediaries, having family friends call to tell me I was breaking my mother's heart and should reconcile. Then came the first concerning call from Jessica. Her voice was strained as she explained that Richard and our mother were suddenly reviewing the coverage of her medical treatments, suggesting that perhaps she could switch to less expensive options. The implicit threat was clear. I decided it was time to investigate my legal options regarding not only the current situation but also my father's original inheritance. I contacted a lawyer specializing in estate disputes, who asked me to bring any documentation I had regarding my father's will and financial affairs. Searching through boxes of papers I had kept after my father's death, I found copies of his will that I had never fully understood as a teenager. Reading it with adult eyes, I discovered specific provisions for my education that had clearly been ignored. There were also letters addressed to me, to be given when I turned 18, that I had never received. The contents of those letters changed everything. My father had anticipated potential issues with my mother's management of his estate. He outlined specific assets that should have been held in trust for me, detailed his contributions to the family business, and expressed his wishes for how his legacy should support my future. Armed with this information, the lawyer identified several discrepancies in how my mother had handled my father's estate. There was enough evidence to suggest that she may have misappropriated funds specifically designated for me. We began quietly building a case not to pursue out of vengeance, but to establish leverage for protecting Jessica and possibly recovering what was rightfully mine. Meanwhile, I maintained my distance from my mother and Richard, focusing on work and gathering information. I reached out to old family friends and business associates of my father, piecing together a clearer picture of the family business history and my father's role in its success. Many were surprisingly forthcoming, having harbored concerns about Richard's management for years but feeling powerless to intervene. The situation escalated 3 weeks after the dinner confrontation. At 2 a.m., my phone rang with Jessica's ringtone. Her voice was panicked, barely coherent through tears. "I am in the emergency room," she gasped. "My medication. They canceled the insurance coverage for my medication last week without telling me. I had a severe flare-up, and now they will not answer their phones. The hospital needs payment information, and I do not know what to do." "Which hospital?" I asked, already grabbing my keys and wallet. "I will be there in 20 minutes. Tell them your brother is coming to handle everything." When I arrived, Jessica looked smaller than ever in the hospital bed attached to monitors and an IV. Her condition, normally managed with expensive but effective medication, had deteriorated rapidly without treatment. The attending physician explained that she was experiencing a dangerous inflammatory response that required immediate intervention and likely several days of hospitalization. "Insurance?" the intake coordinator asked when I identified myself as responsible for her care. "I will pay directly," I responded, providing my credit card and contact information. The total would be substantial, but I had savings and a good credit limit. Jessica's health was worth far more than money. While Jessica stabilized with treatment, I called our mother repeatedly. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I finally reached her the following morning. "Jessica is in the hospital," I said without preamble. Her medication coverage was canceled. There was a pause before my mother responded, her voice artificially composed. "Richard has been restructuring some of our insurance and investment portfolios. There may have been a temporary lapse in coverage. I am sure it can be sorted out." "A temporary lapse that could have killed your daughter," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "I have paid for her emergency care, but we need to discuss her ongoing treatment." "That will not be necessary," my mother replied stiffly. "Once she is discharged, she should come home. We will handle everything from here." "She is coming to stay with me," I countered, "at least until we have guaranteed that her medical needs will be consistently met." My mother's voice turned cold. "That is not your decision to make, Arlo. Jessica is part of this household. Jessica is an adult who deserves proper care and respect, not to be used as a pawn in whatever game you and Richard are playing." I responded. "This conversation is over. I will be speaking with Jessica about her options once she is feeling better." When my mother and Richard finally arrived at the hospital that afternoon, the confrontation was public and ugly. Richard attempted to take charge, speaking condescendingly to the medical staff about transferring Jessica to a different facility. I intervened, producing documentation that I had been designated as her emergency contact and temporary medical decision-maker. Their faces when the hospital administrator confirmed my authority were studies in shocked rage. My mother turned pale, while Richard's complexion darkened to an alarming red. They left, after making a scene that drew attention from staff and visitors alike, promising unspecified consequences for my interference. Jessica recovered enough for discharge 3 days later, and I brought her to my apartment. Having her there revealed the extent of her anxiety and dependence on our mother's approval. She jumped at every phone notification, expecting angry messages. She apologized constantly for causing trouble. Most concerningly, she admitted that Richard had been controlling her access to her medication for months, requiring her to ask permission before each dose, as a way of ensuring her responsibility with expensive treatments. While Jessica recuperated in my guest room, we began sorting through old family photos and papers she had brought with her. Among them, we discovered documents related to our grandfather's original business and estate planning. "I found these in the back of Mother's closet when I was looking for my birth certificate last year," Jessica explained. "I did not understand their significance then. The documents revealed that our grandfather had established specific provisions for how the family wealth should be distributed and managed. Most surprisingly, there were clear intentions that both my father and eventually his children would maintain significant control of the business and family assets. These provisions had apparently been circumvented after his death. With these new documents, I consulted both my lawyer and a forensic accountant specializing in family business disputes. The picture that emerged was troubling. Richard had systematically restructured the family holdings, moving assets into entities he controlled and leveraging the original business to finance his own ventures. My mother, either willingly or through manipulation, had signed off on these changes, despite their conflict with my grandfather's explicit wishes. We also discovered financial irregularities that suggested potential tax evasion and fraudulent reporting to business partners. The forensic accountant recommended a more thorough investigation and suggested that these findings could interest regulatory authorities. As we built our case quietly, Richard escalated his counterattack. Somehow he learned of my inquiries and responded aggressively. First came the professional threats. As a senior figure in the business community, he had connections at several major companies, including my employer. Suddenly, I found myself assigned to less desirable projects with hints from my manager about concerns from upstairs regarding my performance. Then came the public smear campaign. Rumors circulated among family and friends that I was mentally unstable, vindictive, and attempting to extort money from my mother. Several relatives called to express concern about my breakdown and urged me to apologize to my mother and Richard before I destroyed my reputation. The situation took its toll on Jessica's recovery. The stress caused her symptoms to worsen again, and she became increasingly anxious about the future. "Maybe I should just go back," she suggested one evening after particularly nasty texts from our mother. "I am causing you too many problems." "You are not going back to an environment that treats your health as a bargaining chip," I insisted. "We are going to find a permanent solution." That night, after Jessica went to sleep, I received an anonymous email with my home address and workplace, in the subject line, containing only the words, "Be careful." The implied threat crystallized my resolve. This was no longer just about inheritance or family dysfunction. It was about standing up to manipulation and abuse of power. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. One of Richard's former business partners contacted me after hearing about the family conflict. "Your stepfather ruined my company through similar tactics," the man explained. "He isolates people from their support systems, then leverages their vulnerabilities. He did it to your mother, and he has done it to many business associates. I have documentation that might help you." This connection led to others. Soon I had a small network of people who had experienced Richard's predatory business practices firsthand. Their collective evidence, combined with the documents Jessica and I had found, created a compelling case not just for our family dispute, but potentially for broader legal action. Working with my lawyer, I developed a strategic approach. First, we filed a formal claim regarding my father's inheritance, using the letters and will copies as evidence. This was primarily a pressure tactic designed to get my mother's attention, without yet revealing the full extent of our knowledge about the business irregularities. Simultaneously, I applied for legal guardianship of Jessica, citing the deliberate withholding of medical care as evidence that our mother and Richard were not acting in her best interests. This move was designed to protect Jessica from being forced to return to their home while we resolved the larger issues. When Richard realized the seriousness of our legal actions, he attempted to settle quietly. His lawyer contacted mine, offering to resolve the misunderstanding with a modest payment if I would drop all claims and return Jessica to the family home. "Not interested," was my response. "This is not about money anymore." The case began attracting attention beyond our immediate circle. Several business publications picked up on rumors of irregularities at the Blackwood Group, as Richard had renamed the family business. Investors and partners started asking questions about financial management and corporate governance. Richard, who had built his reputation on projecting strength and control, suddenly found himself on the defensive. My mother, faced with growing evidence of Richard's manipulations and possible legal consequences, finally reached out directly, rather than through lawyers. She asked to meet me alone at a coffee shop away from Richard's influence. I agreed with my lawyer's knowledge. She looked older than I remembered, the carefully maintained facade of perfection showing cracks of stress and uncertainty. For the first time in years, I glimpsed moments of the mother I had known before my father's death. "I may have been hasty at dinner," she began, avoiding my eyes. "Family wealth is complicated. Perhaps we could revisit the terms of the will." "This is not about the will anymore," I replied calmly. "This is about years of manipulation, about Jessica's health being used as leverage, about grandfather's and father's legacies being distorted. The will was just the final insult that forced me to look deeper." My mother's composure wavered. "Richard has managed our finances for years. I trusted his expertise. If there have been oversights or problems, I was not aware. Willful blindness is still a choice, Mother, I said. You chose Richard and his lifestyle over your children's well-being repeatedly. You allowed him to isolate you from family who would have questioned his decisions. You signed documents without reading them because they provided the luxury you wanted. She looked down at her untouched coffee. What do you want now, Arlo? Justice and safety, I answered. For Jessica, for me, and for everyone else Richard has manipulated. And eventually perhaps a mother who sees her children as more than assets or liabilities on a balance sheet. The meeting ended without resolution, but it marked a shift. My mother began requesting financial documents from Richard, asking questions she had previously avoided. Their united front showed the first visible cracks. Within weeks, the situation escalated beyond family dynamics. Based on information provided by Richard's former business associates and our own evidence, regulatory authorities opened an investigation into the Blackwood Group's financial practices. Richard, facing scrutiny of his business dealings, began rapidly liquidating personal assets. My mother experienced a health scare during this period, a minor heart episode that doctors attributed to stress. During her brief hospitalization, she had time away from Richard's constant presence. I visited her, bringing photographs of Jessica's improved health in my care. She looks happy, my mother said, softly touching the images. Healthier than she has in months. She is, I confirmed. Her doctor says with proper medication management, she could live an almost normal life, possibly even work part-time. My mother was silent for a long moment. I wanted to provide for her. That was part of why I stayed with Richard. His money meant she would always have care. At what cost, though, I asked. Being controlled and afraid is not security. The legal proceedings moved forward with unexpected results. The judge reviewing my father's inheritance case was particularly concerned by the evidence that funds earmarked for my education had been misappropriated. He ruled in my favor, requiring my mother to repay the original amount plus interest, which represented a significant sum after 18 years. Rather than appealing, my mother agreed to the judgment. She also did not contest Jessica's temporary guardianship arrangement, allowing my sister to remain in my care while maintaining visitation rights. The larger investigation into the Blackwood Group's practices continued, with Richard facing increasing legal jeopardy. My mother, advised by her own newly hired counsel, began separating her assets from his, protecting what remained of the original family business from the fallout of his actions. Jessica flourished with consistent medical care and freedom from manipulation. She began taking online classes, planning a future that did not depend on our mother's approval or Richard's control. The fearful, apologetic person she had been gradually gave way to a young woman with opinions, preferences, and growing confidence. I used a portion of the recovered inheritance to establish a small foundation honoring my father, focused on educational opportunities for young people who had lost parents. The foundation also supported research into treatments for autoimmune conditions like Jessica's, turning our family trauma into something constructive. My relationship with my mother remained complicated. There were tentative steps toward reconciliation, coffee meetings that began awkwardly but gradually allowed for honest conversations about the past and present. I maintained firm boundaries, while remaining open to the possibility that she could change, particularly as her relationship with Richard deteriorated under legal and financial pressure. 6 months after that fateful dinner, Richard faced indictment for financial crimes related to his business practices. My mother filed for divorce shortly thereafter, citing years of emotional manipulation and financial deception. The family business, much reduced but salvageable, returned to its original name, honoring my grandfather's legacy. The journey from that moment of standing up at the dinner table to rebuilding some semblance of a healthy family was neither simple nor complete. There were setbacks, difficult conversations, and lingering trust issues. The wound of my mother placing her hand on that will and disowning me would always be part of our history. Yet there was also healing, both for Jessica's physical health and for our family's emotional landscape. We created new traditions, celebrated holidays on our own terms, and gradually expanded our circle to include supportive friends and relatives who had been pushed away during Richard's influence. Through it all, I kept returning to the lesson that had sustained me from the moment I walked out of that toxic dinner. True wealth is not measured in inheritances or bank accounts, but in the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it costs you. Sometimes the price of dignity seems high in the moment, but its value appreciates with every day you live authentically. When faced with the choice between toxic wealth and personal integrity, choose yourself. Family should lift you up, not tear you down. Money that comes with control is not a gift. It is a cage. And sometimes the family you rebuild from the ashes of betrayal is stronger than the one you were born into. If you have ever had to draw a difficult boundary with family, share your experience in the comments below. Remember to subscribe for more stories of family dynamics, personal growth, and standing up for yourself. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps someone feeling trapped in similar circumstances. Find the courage to choose their own path forward.